Thanks for bearing with me. And well, we talked about the Hmong population before, and there's a cluster in Minnesota because specifically there were elected leaders who felt that was a population that was basically abandoned after the Vietnam War. This is Somali. In Somali, a similar thing when you talk about step and chain migration. There's actually a well-known professor at the University of Minnesota who is a bit of an elder in that community, and they basically made connections locally and found that this was an inviting place, and so that's part of the reason why we have. But I would say also the geography of where people migrate to is often based on the economies of different places, right? We talked about how migration is usually because people are looking for work, looking for a better job. In general, these are states that tend to have a bit better economies than others. There are forces that culturally kind of divide us and that pull us together. One of the classic examples is Ireland. Plenty of people have Irish ancestry, but they don't know a lot about the history of Ireland and kind of what went down there and why there's strife and conflict. Well, in a nutshell, the UK colonized or attempted to colonize all of Ireland, but they colonized basically a segment of Ireland. And so that area, because it's mixed, and when this map's in the book and it shows Protestants versus Catholics, well, the Protestant populations were the population who came over, and then the Catholic population are the population who are, I guess I would say, indigenous to this area. And that's created, as you can see, it's kind of an even split. And when there's an even split, and it's interesting because due to what we call cultural simplification, our minds, and we think about Ireland, you usually just think a couple cultural things. You don't think about the internal kind of politics. I would say things are relatively peaceful in this area compared to how they were, when I was your age, when there'd be kind of daily bombings and shootings and things that would happen. It was a pretty active conflict. I would say, well, as you can see, the populations are kind of divided up a bit, and through time, people have moved around even more. And so, as far as whether this is a place that is going to eventually tear itself apart or remain more kind of united, the populations themselves aren't categorized in a way that's easy for them to split. Maybe if everybody was in one section, then it'd be more likely that there could be some large cultural divide at some point. But I think in this example, there's more integration basically happening. The book talks about a couple different examples of cultures that are looking to kind of split off. A lot of indigenous populations in Latin America, for example, do live in an area of the country that is not as mixed with the other populations, and so those are areas that have often wanted more independence, more sovereignty. There have been political fights for that. And this picture is part of the Basque region of Spain. People ever heard of Basque separatists? Maybe. They're more on the news internationally, or if you're in Europe than in the US. But in a nutshell, I talk about this more when we talk about, this region a bit more in a couple of chapters and whatnot. But basically, populations in Europe, although people think of it in their mind as a kind of stable population that has been existing forever, and they all think of like Spain and Spanish people just kind of being one coherent culture. But there's actually been lots of waves of populations that have come over through Europe, and most of the populations on most areas of the world are not populations who were there before. There are other populations who were there before. In Spain, there's a small area, and they're the Basque, and they have different language, different cultural norms, different in all kinds of different ways, and they've often kind of petitioned and wanted to be separate from Spain, be their own country. But the rest of Spain has basically not really allowed them to. And this conflict also has its ups and downs. There are not recently, but within the past 10 years, there's been bombings and things like that by specific separatists who want to cut off ties with the rest of Spain. Oh, and that's it for that. All right. Like I said, switching to chapter 7. All right. Like I said, like I was mentioning, that this chapter talks about food and cuisine. Do people have a favorite food that's not a local food, I guess I would say? Local in origin? What's the best food in the world? No opinions? No foodies?
I don't know, I haven't tried all the foods in the world.
Well, imagine I'm implying of the foods you've tried, what is your favorite food?
Pad Thai.
What's that?
Pad Thai.
Oh, pad Thai. Thai food is quite good, delicious. Pad Thai, I would agree that that is a real good food. I prefer Indian food. Anyone, people like Indian food? Alright. I would say these days, Indian restaurants tend to not have the buffets that they used to, and that was made it a lot easier to try things. That's how I first tried out Indian food. Actually, I don't think I tried it until I was probably in college. But to me, that's the best food in the world. Although, honestly, when I went to India, the food wasn't as good, which I was very surprised by. But it's all about ingredients and costs, and a lot of the food I ate was kind of like street food, kind of on the run, very cheap, and it would just often not have a lot of flavor, whereas kind of Indian food is famously known for all the flavors and stuff. Does anyone say American food is their favorite food? Nobody? Oh yeah? What American food?
I don't know, probably just burgers in general.
A hamburger.
Yeah.
Which, from Hamburg, Germany, right? Is that American food? Or is that German food that's been Americanized? Right? Yeah.
It's interesting. How do you define American food? Because most American food is just we've taken food from another country, changed it in some way, and that's usually generally what is American food. But it's often just something else from another country that's been altered slightly.
Well, this is actually really connected to a term from this chapter, cultural convergence, because indeed, well, there's a lot of cultural convergence happening in the world, and what that means when cultures are kind of like all kind of assimilating into one another, and in many ways, like when I travel and whatnot, if you want American food, they're just like fast food, like in the rest of the world, they're like, that's what they think of when they think of American food, although it depends on where you go and kind of what you're doing. When I was in India, actually, there was a KFC being built. And I was like, oh my gosh, you guys have KFC? And they're like, oh yeah, you have KFC? I was like, well, where do you think it comes from? And they're like, Kentucky? I was like, okay, fair enough. But due to chains and whatnot, a lot of these things are kind of like mixing up. And sure, when you travel, for example, if you go to India and you go to McDonald's, they'll have basically less cow options. They'll have more vegetarian options because that's what the population wants. And if any of you have traveled, I know a person who only eats fast food when they travel because they're a finicky eater. I wouldn't recommend that, but I would recommend trying at least one if you travel, just to see the differences and whatnot. But yeah, it's like, what is American food? It's like, well, when it comes down to it, there is indigenous food that is quite delicious and whatnot. It's like, well, I would say also America is known for the hybrids, the mixtures. And so, for example, well, it's like Tex-Mex, right? It's like, well, that is something that came together, a number of different cultures brought things together. Or I would say, if you have most restaurants, if you have Chinese food, it is very Americanized Chinese food, right? That's the other thing that I found when I've traveled is local palates are very different. And so, well, when I was in college, I did a study abroad in Spain. I super recommend to study abroad if you get a chance to do it. And when I lived there, like I went to a Mexican restaurant because I wanted something that wasn't Spanish food. I found personally Spanish food to be very bland, but because in general in Spain they like bland food, when I would go to restaurants that I would think they would have spicy food, it would not be. It would not be. And that's actually the case in a lot of American restaurants and whatnot. They will have kind of blander versions of things. So including when you go, if you get pad thai, they might ask you, do you want it Thai hot? Which is how hot it would be in Thailand. Most people can't handle that. And they'll kind of say, you want Minnesota hot, which is like more of a medium. So it really depends, Excuse me, learning objectives. So we're talking about diffusion, and this chapter is about culture, but the things that we're talking about, the geographic mechanisms of how things spread around the world, relate to everything from food to technology. Diffusion, process, cultural trait spreads from one place to another over time. These can be fashion trends, these can be all kinds of things. As kind of sounds logical, there's usually a central place that this thing happened and came about, right? I would say a big example, often these textbooks use are something like Starbucks, right? Like you have Starbucks here, but it didn't come from here, right? Where'd Starbucks come from? Right? People don't know?
Canada?
Seattle.
Oh.
Seattle kind of famously. Now, it didn't spread through relocation diffusion. There's all kinds of different diffusions. Relocation diffusion is when people bring whatever it is with them. So it wasn't necessarily people moving from Seattle to Minnesota that brought Starbucks. A number of the things that have diffused around the world that people often kind of don't think about. K-pop, right? People know K-pop well at all. There's some people who are mega fans around the world. Soccer is one of those things that is actually very popular kind of everywhere. Kind of whatever country you're from, people are very, very interested in it. Some places more than others, obviously. I would say it's a growing sport in the U.S. When I travel to Europe, though, boy, they're crazy about the soccer. Again, we're talking about diffusion of things, expansion diffusion, when aspects of culture spreads outward from where it originated. Expansion diffusion, I would say lately people often think about disease, COVID and other things, and that's true. That's how that has spread. Well, we are going to go over a couple of these different types of diffusion. This example here, of course, being the diffusion of Christianity. This is Brazil. Of course, this was brought over with populations who brought it themselves, right, during colonialism. Contagious diffusion, not just disease, all kinds of things diffuse this way, slang words, like I said, fashion trends, all kinds of things. And this process has been speeding up because we're so much more interconnected these days. Hierarchical diffusion, that's basically when something is spreading, but it might skip over places, right? So for example, when Starbucks kind of started taking off in the Twin Cities, to stay with the Starbucks example, there's actually lots of states that it kind of skipped, right? It didn't go to Montana and be big there, or the Dakotas before here. It skipped. It went to places that were, tended to have better economies, right? And more urban populations. They were the first kind of consumers. Hierarchical diffusion, right? Spread, skips places. I would say, an example the book talks about is states with laws against harassing or bullying students who are LGBTQIA+. As you can see, this diffused from a couple of first laws that actually happened in New York and California, but it didn't spread evenly across the landscape. It jumped over other places, right? Other things, to stick with the topic of disease, people remember the first COVID cases in the U.S. and it didn't spread evenly. It spread it through travel hubs, and travel hubs in the U.S. tend to be air travel hubs, right? And so a number of places that were travel hubs are the ones that, before people even knew what it was, are where it was spread. Stimulus diffusion, when a fundamental idea behind a cultural trait stimulates new innovation. So you could have, like I said, well, as it says, one thing that then encourages the development of other things. So cars going everywhere, well, that diffusion of car technology, places developed their own cars, places developed their own roads to adapt to the cars, and all kinds of things interconnected. Actually, I'm not going to do this activity. Historical causes of diffusion, colonialism and imperialism. Usually empires, and there have been, empires are the way humans have organized themselves for most of our existence. When an empire spreads around somewhere, and that's how empires work, empires have to grow to sustain themselves, because they grow by basically consuming new places, right? Yeah, empires grow, they usually enslave populations in areas that they grow into, and they usually steal a bunch of their stuff, and that's how they keep kind of their central power going. In the process of imperialism is usually forced assimilation, right? When they would take over a place, they would force that population to adapt not only the language of that empire, but the cultural norms, the religion, all these different things were basically forced on those populations. Through time, a number of things happened. Well, even when the empires fall, a lot of that, there could be the residue of different things, populations that empire moved around, languages that were forced on that population. What often has happened through time is, well, I think I got a map here somewhere. That's not a good map. Where's a good map? Skipping ahead. There we go. So colonial Africa, right? Even after post-colonialism happened and the empires fell, but since a lot of languages were basically forced on these different countries, they very often found that they would still use that language for trade and communication in larger groups. Although often, well, as we saw from the video, people would be multilingual and whatnot, but that would become a lingua franca through time. Increasingly, this backtracking here, increasingly the lingua franca of modern day has been English, in no small part because so much of the internet is just done with English. I think that might change because, well, AI technology is making it so that translations are much more rapid and easy to do, and so people are putting things in all kinds of languages, so that might change up. Other historical causes of diffusion, trade and trade networks, right? Or the common examples of that is, well, the Silk Road, as it was called. A large trade network, and actually this was a network that a number of empires would grow and subside, and that a number of different technologies and things would be spread. But this is in part because, well, an example from Guns, Germs, and Steel, we saw that gunpowder and whatnot was invented over here, but the invention of guns themselves was actually more over here. And you know, in that example, they talk about Europe a lot. Europe took those guns and kind of made them a bit better, but a lot of that other stuff, if it hadn't been for these trade routes, those things would not have been connected. And then, of course, obviously migration, because when people migrate, they bring stuff with them. These PowerPoints come with a lot of knowledge checks and stuff, but like, I don't want to stop every 2 minutes and give y'all a pop quiz. Contemporary causes of diffusion. globalization. Globalization, the process of the world becoming more and more interconnected. A lot of people have kind of seen globalization as a bit of a neo-colonialism because they feel like that what's being spread is U.S. Culture and whatnot. And to some extent that's true, but I would say the aspect that's often being spread is just kind of like commercialism and commercial culture, not necessarily other cultural elements, but it kind of depends. But the growth of movies and TV shows, for example, well, the U.S. tends to be the biggest market who makes a lot of those, and so very often they're geared toward U.S. audiences. Through time, actually, a lot of movies have been trying to become more, diverse and trying to appeal to more global audiences. Diffusion's also happening a lot through urbanization. Urbanization is the process that's still going on around the world of rural populations moving to cities for work, because rural occupations, salaries are going down, have been for a long time, but places that are industrializing and developing very specifically, that's kind of one of the main things that happens when a place develops is wages, farms get mechanized, right? And then wages go down. It's been happening in the US for a long time as well. Quite a few farmers in the US, they can't make enough money on their own farm, so they usually pick up other jobs as well. Let me back up a second. Didn't specifically talk about this example. Number of people who speak the largest languages, right? You could say English being kind of, one of the big ones, right? And this isn't just because England itself was a large colonial power, but again, because of the internet, and people are encouraged to learn it in order to do things online. Right, most common languages on the web. You could see English is far above, closest next to Russian, but that's a very small percent compared to English. And I'm not going to do a case study. Cultural convergence, I talked about this a bit at the beginning of class. Cultural convergence, cultures interact, they become more similar. I would say that as a longtime traveler, this is really, I've noticed this happening a lot. Many years ago when I would first travel, when I'd go to places, including when I did a study abroad in Spain, it was very different culturally and whatnot. But these days when I go back, the grocery stores kind of all look the same. They look like grocery stores here. A lot of the things that had been unique have kind of simplified or subsided quite a bit, and there's more of a kind of a global culture happening, this very kind of similarity, and I've seen this in Asia as well and other places that I've traveled to as this type of international culture becomes the norm in lots of places. A book talks a bit about Tobler's law, first law of geography. This law is very simple in that, if something is diffusing, it is the immediacy effect, right? Those that are closest tend to be the first adapters, and this thing may fade as it spreads through space. This is as far as everything goes, like how religion spreads, and languages, and technologies. And so what we have happening through time is a lot of places are becoming what we call placeless. Placeless, a big topic in geography. Placeless just being, like I said, kind of commercialism, right? It's like as I mentioned, when I go to a store in another country, it'll just seem like a carbon copy of a store here, right? Same products, same stuff, organized the same way. Big global manufacturers all kind of making the same things. I would say one of the main examples of placelessness is kind of, if you go to just like a strip mall, right? They'll just kind of if you woke up and you're at a strip mall that was in a town in America, you probably would not necessarily know what town you're in immediately. I'm not gonna do journal activity. Cultural divergence, right? This is things culturally where things are looking for difference. And the kind of interesting thing is, during a time that we're having a lot of cultural convergence and a lot of things just kind of like homogenizing into sameness, we also see the opposite pressure of places and people trying to be unique, trying to be different, trying to be distinctive. Subcultures come about. But it's kind of interesting though, because like a lot of things that are subcultures, like the punk subculture, that, well, in my youth it was kind of, it would be unique for someone to kind of like have a shaved head or have facial piercings. Whereas I would say today, I kind of see it all over the place. Like it's not that much of a difference as much as it used to be, right? It's kind of like been adapted culturally. There's a big change going on culturally in generations right now. Talked about this a little bit. Put a little summary here of how the generations are changing through time. And this change, generational change, cultural change, it's not something that usually kind of happens easily. It's something that is usually contested at the time. And I would say there's a lot of political volatility in the US these days, right? And a lot of it is because we have new generations kind of coming in. Well, and this is you guys, Gen Z. New generations who have new norms, new priorities that are often the opposite of older generations who still hold a lot of power and who are still voting and have a lot of economic power, right? And so this change that's happening, it's rare. This is the generational change politically that's happening is something that happens kind of once every 100 years or so. It's kind of a big transformation. I'm not going to do partner activity. Some more key terms. Culturation, people within one culture adopt some of the traits of another while still retaining its own distinct culture. Like I said, the classic example is often food, or sometimes the term globalization is used, where you'll have a global brand of some kind go into a new market, but the individuals there might just not want that thing. Or they might want parts of it, right? So they might want the convenience of fast food, but they don't want the actual food of the fast food that franchise has. So that franchise will either adapt or it won't move into that new territory. Intersectionality, this is a term that's kind of used a lot these days. This is basically just a way to see how different cultures come together and how each individual isn't really defined by kind of one cultural trait, but multiple cultural traits, right? And these cultural traits, they could have advantage or disadvantage to them, kind of depending. So like, to use a random example, you're all college students. Have you guys been to like Cancun in that area, spring break area? There's a bunch of expensive resorts over there that I don't know if you guys are from rich families or not. I'm not from a rich family, but when I go there, like I'll just get a cheap hotel, but if I want to go to a nice beach that is in a resort that is customers only, well, I just have to dress well, and I'm a tall white man. And I could just walk into it and no one will ever ask me anything about it. They'll even come and offer me free drinks. I say no, but I'll use their beach. That's intersectionality, right? I have these things that allow me to just do that, these advantages that other people don't have. I would say very often I'll see the security really questioning someone, especially if they look indigenous, and this is in Mexico, but they'll be kind of scrutinizing someone, make sure it's like, why should you be in here? And they'll be like, well, yes, I have this hotel room and I pay my bills, and why are you hassling me instead of this tall guy? Assimilation. again, like I said, historically, through most of human history, empire building, there's been a lot of forced assimilation. There's been populations who were forced to not just adopt languages, but religion and all kinds of different cultural norms, because all these colonial powers really felt that their culture and every aspect of it was superior, right? And so if you were French and you would colonize a country, you would decide every single thing, including clothing. You would say, well, it's just better because we have it, and so you have to also do it. An amount of assimilation, of course, is voluntary. I think I've used the example before of German populations in the U.S. 2 world wars where they are the bad guys. Although Germans are the largest ethnicity in the U.S., they went through a assimilation, right? Where they're just like, we're just going to be Americanized, we're going to be doing American things. And I would say also, there's controversy often about assimilation in immigrant populations, because sometimes the assimilation process is slow, and sometimes people just don't want to. But for the most part, populations do, especially when it comes to immigrant populations. The population that is then raised in the U.S., whether they immigrate as children or they're born here, they'll lose a lot of the cultural knowledge of especially if they haven't been to the home country. The other thing about culture is it's always a changing thing. And all cultures are mixtures of other cultures. There's no kind of inherent origination. Everything is just like a flow that is always changing. And in the lifespan of humans, it seems like all these things are eternal and forever, but they're not. And huge cultural norms can just switch off, especially if you have a big generational change happening. I would say, in general, geographers like to study how these cultures come together. Like religions become hybrids, and they'll adapt completely new and different things. And again, that's another thing that people will think of as, they'll think of, especially if it's their religion, they'll think of it as this eternal thing. But these religions that are the main religions around the world are all relatively recent things. Oh, I don't have those slides. Some more terms. Well, actually, I want to give you guys enough time to work on some questions. Oh, am I that near the end anyway? All right. Then I'll just finish up this chapter then. A couple more terms. Multiculturalism. That is, well, what the term sounds like, right? People who share lots of different aspects of culture. Very often this is because, you have parents who are from different cultures and you want to kind of respect and assume both those cultures. And there's pressures, of course, for places for people to assimilate. An example of this in modern day would be, for example, if you look at census numbers, you would see that one of the largest and quickest growing categories is people who are multiracial, right? And it's like, well, why would that be? Well, I mean, people hang out, they have kids together. That's how that works. But actually, there's a whole other reason as well. On the census forms, they used to make you pick. You'd have to pick one race or the other, right? And so that's a bit of a forced assimilation of you need to identify yourself by these cultural norms. Click on white or black, right? It's only more recently that they've changed the census to be like, actually, click on the things that make sense. It's like you might be Hispanic and white and black and maybe some other stuff too, right? And so now those as categories have been growing rapidly. Collectivist cultures, this is a difference that is not actually, a lot of immigrants will come from places that have more collectivist cultures. In the U.S., typically does not have that much of a collectivist culture. It's more of an individualist culture. And that will be a process where it's like, well, do they want to change that up? Is that something they really want to assimilate out, or do they want to keep their cultural connections? cultural appropriation, adopting element of another culture typically done by dominant culture with elements of minority culture. I would say a classic example of that is like when Halloween comes up, you'll often get someone who is very much European and they will dress up as a Native American or something because they figure it's Halloween. That is something that people would consider cultural appropriation because you're very much not part of that culture, right? All right. Yeah, I got some questions. I do got some questions. All right, I'm gonna come out and do the card thing to get you into little groups and get you thinking about these questions. Do you have the foresight to shuffle these? Not really. Okay. And shuffle. Skip you or did I get full attendance again today?